Highway 7 stretched through rural Saskatchewan like a ribbon of asphalt, cutting across endless prairie grassland, and Rosemary Whitehaven had driven this route twice weekly for the past 5 years, without ever noticing the horror that had been hidden just beyond the tree line. But the recent removal of a row of evergreen trees had exposed something that made her 73-year-old heart pound with recognition and outrage as she pulled her pickup truck to the roadside. Through the rusted chain-link fence of what had once been the prosperous Oakridge cattle ranch, a massive bull stood motionless in a small concrete enclosure, heavy chains wrapped around his neck and anchored to a steel post driven deep into the frozen ground. The sight violated everything Rosemary had learned during her 47 years as a livestock veterinarian before retiring to her small farm near Clearwater Springs. The bull, a magnificent Angus who should have been grazing freely across hundreds of acres, stood with his massive head lowered, his once proud bearing broken by what appeared to be years of confinement. The chains around his neck were heavy enough to anchor a boat, and the concrete area where he was trapped couldn't have been more than 20 feet square, barely enough room for the animal to turn around. "Dear God," Rosemary whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the cold October air. "How long have you been standing there, you poor soul?" She remembered when this land had been filled with healthy cattle roaming freely under the care of old Henrik Ironwood, but that was before Garrett Ironwood had inherited the property and slowly let it deteriorate into the neglected wasteland that now stretched before her. Garrett had a reputation in the community for being both lazy and cruel, but this level of deliberate animal abuse exceeded even the worst rumors she'd heard. Everything in Rosemary's professional experience told her that what she was witnessing constituted criminal neglect. No bull, regardless of temperament or behavior issues, should be kept in chains like a dog, especially not in the harsh Saskatchewan climate where winter temperatures could drop to 40 below zero and summer heat could reach over 90 degrees. She pulled out her phone to call the local RCMP detachment, but hesitated when she noticed the no trespassing signs that covered every inch of the fence. Garrett Ironwood was known for being litigious and vindictive toward anyone who interfered with his property, and Rosemary understood that a complaint from a retired veterinarian might be dismissed as the meddling of an overly sentimental old woman. But as she watched the bull shift slightly in his chains, she noticed something that broke her heart completely. Where the heavy metal had rubbed against his neck for what must have been months or years, the fur had worn away entirely, leaving raw patches of skin that spoke of constant pain and suffering that no living creature should endure. "You're not just chained," she said softly, studying the bull's condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades treating abused animals. "You're being tortured, and somebody needs to do something about it." The bull lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, and Rosemary saw intelligence in his dark eyes that had somehow survived whatever treatment had broken his spirit. There was still life in that massive frame, still hope in an animal that should have given up long ago. That evening, Rosemary sat in her farmhouse kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold as she wrestled with a decision that would define the rest of her life. She could report what she'd seen to authorities and hope they would take action, or she could do what 47 years of veterinary experience told her was necessary: take direct action to end suffering that had gone on far too long. "Sometimes," she said to her old collie Duncan, who lay at her feet sensing her distress, "the right thing to do isn't the same as the legal thing to do. And sometimes an old woman has to decide whether she's going to live with regret or live with consequences." The bull in chains had awakened something in Rosemary Whitehaven that retirement and age had quieted, a fierce determination to fight for creatures who couldn't fight for themselves, regardless of the personal cost of that fight. If this story of courage in the face of cruelty already has your heart breaking for both the bull and the woman who won't turn away, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that prove it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Duncan's restless pacing around the farmhouse kitchen matched Rosemary's own sleepless night as she struggled with what she'd witnessed at the abandoned Oakridge Ranch. 3 cups of coffee and 2 hours of staring out the window at her own cattle grazing peacefully in the dawnlight had convinced her that doing nothing wasn't an option her conscience could bear. Armed with her old veterinary bag and a thermos of coffee, Rosemary drove back to Highway 7 just after sunrise, parking her truck behind a grove of birch trees where it wouldn't be visible from the ranch house. Years of treating injured animals in remote locations had taught her the value of careful observation before taking action. and she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with before making any moves that might worsen the bull's situation. What she discovered during 2 hours of watching through binoculars made her professional assessment even more grim. The bull, she'd decided to call him Atlas because of his massive size and the weight he seemed to be carrying, showed clear signs of prolonged psychological trauma beyond just physical neglect. His movements were mechanical, his responses to environmental stimuli practically non-existent, and most telling, he showed no interest in the sparse food that had been scattered just within reach of his chains. "You're not just chained, Atlas," she murmured, documenting his condition in the small notebook she'd brought. "You're broken inside, and that's going to make this so much harder." Her documentation was interrupted by the arrival of a battered pickup truck at the ranch house, driven by someone she didn't recognize, but whose behavior immediately raised additional concerns. The man, tall, thin, and moving with the nervous energy of someone with something to hide, went directly to Atlas's enclosure and began shouting at the bull while brandishing what appeared to be a cattle prod. Rosemary's professional outrage shifted into something much more personal as she watched the man, who she assumed was Garrett Ironwood, deliberately torment an animal that was already suffering beyond any reasonable limit. The cruelty was purposeful, systematic, and designed to maintain the psychological dominance that kept Atlas submissive despite his size and natural strength. "That's not discipline," she said, her hands shaking with suppressed anger as she continued taking notes. "That's torture, and you're enjoying it." After the man left, Rosemary made a decision that violated every rule of property law, but satisfied every principle of veterinary ethics she'd sworn to uphold. She climbed through a gap in the chain-link fence and approached Atlas's enclosure, moving slowly and speaking in the gentle tones that had calmed thousands of frightened animals during her career. "Easy, Atlas," she said, settling on the ground just outside his reach. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to figure out how to help you." Atlas's response was heartbreaking in its complete lack of hope or curiosity. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He simply stood in the same position he'd maintained for what might have been years, as if human contact had lost all meaning beyond the potential for additional pain. But as Rosemary sat quietly for nearly an hour, something began to shift in Atlas's demeanor. His ears, which had been pinned back in defensive posture, gradually moved forward. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, slowly deepened. Most significantly, he began to show subtle signs of awareness that this human presence was different from the one that had tormented him earlier. "You remember kindness, don't you?" Rosemary said softly, reaching into her bag for the apple she'd brought. "It's been so long since anyone treated you decently that you'd almost forgotten what it felt like." She placed the apple on the ground within Atlas's reach and retreated to observe his reaction. For several minutes, he ignored it completely, but eventually, hunger overcame wariness, and he stretched his neck as far as the chains would allow to retrieve the unexpected treat. The simple act of eating seemed to awaken something in Atlas that had been dormant for far too long. His posture straightened slightly, his eyes showed the first spark of interest Rosemary had seen, and when she spoke to him again, he actually turned his head to look directly at her. "That's it," she whispered, tears of professional frustration and personal determination running down her cheeks. "You're still in there, Atlas. You're still fighting, even when you don't know you're fighting." Her visit was cut short by the sound of an approaching vehicle, and Rosemary retreated through the fence gap just as Garrett Ironwood returned with another man who appeared to be discussing some sort of business arrangement. Their conversation, which she could hear clearly from her hiding spot, revealed information that made Atlas's situation even more urgent than she'd realized. "The meat buyer's coming Thursday," Garrett was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the prairie air. $1,800 for the whole animal, processed weight. Not much, but it's better than feeding him through another winter. "Seems like a waste of good beef," the other man replied. "Bull that size should be worth more." "Would be if he wasn't completely ruined. Can't breed him, can't show him, can't do anything with him except turn him into hamburger. Should have done it years ago." As the men walked away discussing Atlas as if he were already dead meat, Rosemary understood that her window for action was closing rapidly. Thursday was only 5 days away, which meant she had less than a week to figure out how to liberate an animal that weighed over 2,000 pounds, was secured with heavy chains, and was located on private property owned by someone who wouldn't hesitate to press charges against a 73-year-old woman. But 47 years of veterinary practice had taught her that impossible cases sometimes required impossible solutions, and Atlas's life was worth whatever risks she'd have to take to save it from becoming ground beef in some anonymous slaughterhouse. The elderly woman and the chained bull were about to begin a rescue operation that would test everything Rosemary believed about justice, mercy, and the courage required to do what's right when doing what's legal isn't enough. Rosemary's kitchen table looked like a military planning operation by Wednesday evening, covered with maps of the Oakridge Ranch property, contact lists for animal rescue organizations, and legal documents she'd printed from the internet about animal welfare laws in Saskatchewan. The magnitude of what she was planning, essentially liberating a 2,000-pound bull from private property, would have seemed impossible if not for the memory of Atlas's eyes beginning to show hope again after years of despair. Her first ally came from an unexpected source. Father Michael Stormwind, the elderly priest at St. Catherine's Church in Clearwater Springs, had been Rosemary's friend for over 20 years, and his reaction to her story about Atlas surprised her with its immediate support for what most people would consider theft. "Rosemary, I've known Garrett Ironwood since he was a boy, and cruelty has always been his nature," Father Michael said, settling into her kitchen chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose arthritis had earned him patience with physical limitations. "What you're describing isn't just animal abuse. It's a sin against creation itself. If the law won't protect that bull, then perhaps the law needs help from people with functioning consciences." Father Michael's support mattered because he'd spent 60 years building relationships throughout rural Saskatchewan, and his network of parishioners, farmers, and community members represented resources that Rosemary couldn't access alone. More importantly, his moral authority provided validation for what she was planning that would be crucial if legal consequences followed her actions. "I can't actively participate in what you're planning," Father Michael continued, his eyes twinkling with the mischief of someone who'd learned to work around institutional limitations. "But I can certainly pray very loudly for Atlas's well-being while accidentally mentioning his situation to people who might feel called to help." The second crucial ally emerged from Rosemary's own past when she contacted Dr. Benjamin Thunderhart, a Cree veterinarian who'd been her student 20 years earlier and now ran an animal sanctuary on the nearby Standing Rock Reserve. Benjamin's response to her phone call was immediate and unequivocal support for whatever action was necessary to save Atlas. "Dr. Whitehaven, you taught me that healing sometimes requires breaking rules that weren't written by people who understand suffering," Benjamin said during their clandestine meeting at a truck stop halfway between their properties. "My sanctuary has handled rescues that weren't exactly legal before, and we've got facilities that can house Atlas while he recovers from whatever psychological damage he's suffered." Benjamin's sanctuary was perfect for Atlas's needs. Over 300 acres of natural grassland where the bull could remember what freedom felt like, plus veterinary facilities capable of treating the physical and emotional trauma that years of chaining had inflicted. More importantly, the sanctuary's location on reserve land provided certain legal protections that might complicate any efforts to reclaim Atlas. But their planning was complicated by intelligence that Father Michael had gathered about Garrett Ironwood's increasing paranoia. "He's been asking questions around town about who might be interested in his bull," Father Michael reported during their second meeting. "Apparently, someone told him they'd seen a vehicle parked near his property, and he's convinced that cattle thieves are planning to steal Atlas." The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Garrett's suspicions were entirely accurate, but his assumption that theft was motivated by Atlas's monetary value rather than his welfare created additional urgency. If Garrett became convinced that Atlas was valuable enough to steal, he might accelerate the timeline for sending the bull to slaughter. "We need to move tomorrow night," Benjamin said, studying the aerial photographs that Father Michael had obtained through his network of farming contacts. "Thursday morning that meat buyer arrives, which means Thursday night might be too late." Their plan was necessarily simple given the resources available and the time constraints they faced. Benjamin would arrive with a livestock trailer just after midnight when Garrett was likely to be asleep. Rosemary would handle the complex process of removing Atlas's chains using bolt cutters she'd borrowed from her neighbor. And Father Michael would serve as lookout while providing spiritual support for what all of them understood was morally necessary but legally questionable. "The biggest risk isn't getting caught," Rosemary said, reviewing their timeline one final time. "It's Atlas himself. He's been psychologically broken by years of abuse, and sudden liberation might traumatize him further. We'll need to move slowly and carefully, which means more time on Garrett's property and more chance of discovery. Dr. Whitehaven," Benjamin said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone whose cultural background had taught him different perspectives on ownership and stewardship. "Sometimes healing requires faith that broken spirits remember freedom even when they think they've forgotten it. Atlas survived this long because something inside him refused to give up completely. Tomorrow night, we're going to find out if that something is strong enough to trust us." That evening, as Rosemary sat with Duncan watching the sunset paint the Saskatchewan sky in shades of orange and purple, she reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A routine drive to visit her sister had revealed suffering that she couldn't ignore, and that suffering had awakened a network of people who shared her belief that some principles were more important than property laws. "Tomorrow night, Duncan," she said to her old collie, who seemed to sense the importance of what was coming, "we're going to find out if an old woman, a young veterinarian, and a priest can liberate a bull that's been waiting years for someone to care enough to break his chains." The rescue operation that would define the rest of Atlas's life and test everything Rosemary believed about the courage required to do what's right was less than 24 hours away. Midnight approached with the kind of absolute darkness that only Saskatchewan prairie could provide, broken only by the distant glow of Clearwater Springs streetlights and the thin sliver of moon that would provide just enough illumination for their operation. Rosemary sat behind the wheel of her pickup truck, her 73-year-old hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Benjamin's livestock trailer was parked a quarter-mile down Highway 7, hidden behind the abandoned Mackenzie grain elevator that had been slowly deteriorating since the railroad changed its route 15 years earlier. Father Michael had positioned himself at the crossroads, where he could watch for approaching headlights while maintaining radio contact through the walkie-talkies Benjamin had provided. "All quiet from my position," Father Michael's voice crackled through the radio. "Garrett's house is dark, and I haven't seen any vehicle movement for the past hour. The Lord seems to be smiling on our mission of mercy tonight." Rosemary checked her equipment one final time: bolt cutters heavy enough to handle marine-grade chain, leather gloves to protect her hands, a halter and lead rope that Benjamin had modified for Atlas's size, and the emergency sedative that Dr. Thunderheart had provided in case the bull's psychological state made handling impossible. "Moving in now," she whispered into the radio, though speaking at all felt like breaking the sacred silence that surrounded their operation. The gap in Garrett's fence that she'd used for her previous visits allowed silent entry onto the property, and Rosemary moved across the moonlit ground with the careful steps of someone whose decades of farm work had taught her how to move quietly around nervous animals. Atlas stood in his usual position, chains reflecting faintly in the starlight, his massive form as motionless as a statue carved from shadow. "Easy, Atlas," she whispered as she approached his enclosure. "It's me again. And tonight we're going to end this nightmare once and for all." Atlas's response to her voice was immediate and heartbreaking. His ears moved forward, his head lifted slightly, and for the first time since she'd been watching him, he took a step toward a human presence instead of remaining frozen in defensive posture. The simple movement told Rosemary everything she needed to know about his psychological state and his readiness for liberation. But removing the chains proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. Years of Saskatchewan weather had corroded the metal, but had also fused some of the links together in ways that made cutting difficult. Each snip of the bolt cutters sounded impossibly loud in the prairie silence, and Rosemary found herself pausing after each cut to listen for any sign that Garrett had been awakened by the noise. "Come on, you stubborn metal," she muttered, working through a particularly resistant section of chain that connected Atlas's collar to the anchor post. "You've caused enough suffering. It's time to let go." The moment when the final link separated was magical in its simplicity. Atlas felt the weight of the chains fall away immediately, and his reaction was everything Rosemary had hoped for and more. Instead of panic or confusion, he stepped forward with the deliberate movement of an animal remembering what freedom felt like, his massive frame straightening as if invisible burdens were falling away with the physical restraints. "That's it, beautiful boy," Rosemary whispered, approaching slowly with the halter that would guide him to safety. Remember what it feels like to choose where you want to go. Atlas accepted the halter with surprising cooperation, and Rosemary realized that her weeks of patient observation had been crucial preparation for this moment. He trusted her because she'd proven herself different from the humans who'd caused him pain, and that trust was going to make the difference between successful rescue and dangerous chaos. "Benjamin, we're ready for pickup," she radioed, beginning the slow walk toward the fence gap that would lead Atlas away from years of captivity. But their escape was complicated by Atlas's overwhelming response to experiencing movement without restriction for the first time in years. Every few steps he would stop and simply stand still, as if testing whether the freedom was real or another cruel illusion. Rosemary understood that rushing him would risk undoing the psychological progress they'd achieved, but every minute they remained on Garrett's property increased the chance of discovery. "Take your time, Atlas," she said softly, allowing him to process each new sensation at his own pace. "You've waited this long to be free. A few more minutes won't hurt anything." The loading process into Benjamin's trailer required all their patience and skill. Atlas had probably never been in a vehicle before, and the confined space triggered obvious anxiety, despite his growing trust in his rescuers. But Benjamin's expertise with traumatized animals proved invaluable. He moved with the kind of calm confidence that helped Atlas understand that this temporary confinement was different from the permanent imprisonment he was escaping. "Easy there, big fellow," Benjamin murmured, securing the trailer's safety features while ensuring Atlas had enough space to maintain psychological comfort. "You're going to love where we're taking you. 300 acres of grass, fresh water, and all the time you need to remember how to be a bull again." As Benjamin's truck pulled away from the Oakridge Ranch with Atlas safely secured in the trailer, Rosemary felt a satisfaction deeper than anything she'd experienced during 4 decades of veterinary practice. They'd accomplished something that the legal system had failed to do. They'd ended suffering that had gone on far too long, and they'd given a magnificent animal the chance to remember his own dignity and strength. "Father Michael," she radioed as she reached her own truck, "Atlas is free. Whatever happens next, at least we know we did the right thing." "Rosemary," Father Michael's voice came back filled with emotion that matched her own, "I think we've just witnessed a miracle. Not just Atlas's liberation, but the reminder that ordinary people can still accomplish extraordinary things when they decide that suffering shouldn't be ignored just because it's legal." Sue, the elderly woman who decided to set a bull free, had discovered that liberation was a two-way process. In freeing Atlas from his chains, she'd freed herself from the regret that would have haunted her forever if she'd chosen to look away from cruelty she had the power to end. 3 months after Atlas's liberation, the transformation at Standing Rock Animal Sanctuary had become the talk of rural Saskatchewan, drawing visitors from across the prairie provinces who came to witness what Dr. Benjamin Thunderheart called the most remarkable psychological recovery he'd seen in 20 years of sanctuary work. Rosemary stood at the fence of Atlas's paddock, watching him graze peacefully among a small herd of rescued cattle, his massive frame now carrying the dignified bearing that nature had intended. The legal fallout from their midnight rescue had been surprisingly manageable. Garrett Ironwood had filed theft charges, but the RCMP investigation into his animal care practices had uncovered evidence of systematic abuse that resulted in criminal charges against him rather than his accusers. The photographs Rosemary had taken during her surveillance, combined with veterinary testimony about Atlas's condition, had convinced prosecutors that the rescue was justified under Saskatchewan's animal welfare statutes. "Sometimes justice takes unusual forms," Constable Sarah Brightfeather had told Rosemary during the final interview about the case. "Technically, you committed theft. Practically, you prevented a crime against an animal that couldn't protect himself." The Crown Attorney decided that prosecuting a 73-year-old veterinarian for saving a bull's life wasn't in the public interest. But the legal vindication paled beside the daily miracle of watching Atlas rediscover what it meant to be free. The psychological healing had been gradual but unmistakable. His movements had become fluid and confident. His interactions with other cattle showed natural social instincts returning, and most remarkably, he'd begun to approach humans with curiosity rather than fear. "He's teaching the other rescue animals how to trust again," Benjamin observed, watching Atlas position himself protectively near a nervous young heifer who'd recently arrived at the sanctuary. "Animals recognize authentic strength, and Atlas has earned leadership through patience rather than dominance. The transformation extended beyond Atlas himself to the community that had rallied around his rescue. Father Michael's congregation had raised funds to improve the sanctuary's facilities, local farmers had donated feed and equipment, and the story had inspired similar rescue operations across Western Canada. Dr. Elizabeth Moonfeather, a specialist in animal psychology from the University of Saskatchewan, had begun studying Atlas's recovery as part of research into trauma rehabilitation in large animals. Her preliminary findings suggested that Atlas's case could revolutionize understanding of how psychological damage could be healed through patient, consistent care in appropriate environments. What's remarkable about Atlas isn't just his physical recovery, Dr. Moonfeather explained during a visit to document his progress. It's how completely he's regained his natural dignity and social instincts. Most animals that suffer this level of prolonged abuse never fully recover their psychological health. The most satisfying vindication came when the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation featured Atlas's story in a documentary about animal welfare that aired nationally. The segment portrayed Rosemary as a model of principled action, Benjamin's sanctuary as an example of Indigenous land stewardship, and Father Michael as proof that faith communities could be forces for justice rather than just comfort. What we accomplished here wasn't complicated, Rosemary told the CBC interviewer while standing beside Atlas, who now allowed her to scratch behind his ears without any sign of the defensive behavior that had characterized their early interactions. We simply decided that suffering shouldn't be ignored just because it's happening to someone who can't speak for themselves. The documentary's impact reached far beyond Saskatchewan when animal welfare organizations across North America began citing Atlas's case as proof that citizen intervention could be both morally necessary and legally defensible when official systems failed to protect vulnerable animals. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Ironwood family's neighbors, who'd known about Atlas's situation for years but felt powerless to intervene, established the Atlas Foundation to support similar rescue operations and to ensure that future cases of animal abuse wouldn't be ignored due to property rights or legal technicalities. Rosemary showed us that age doesn't diminish moral responsibility, said Margaret Forestwind, a local teacher who'd become the foundation's coordinator. If a 73-year-old woman could find the courage to break chains that had held a bull for years, then the rest of us have no excuse for turning away from cruelty we have the power to address. 6 months after his rescue, Atlas had become something of a celebrity in the agricultural community, but his most important role remained providing hope and leadership to other animals recovering from human cruelty. His gentle strength and calm intelligence made him the perfect ambassador for the sanctuary's mission of healing trauma through patient care and respect for natural behavior. That evening, as Rosemary made her weekly visit to check on Atlas's progress, she found him standing at the fence where she always parked her truck, as if he'd learned to anticipate her arrival and wanted to greet the woman who'd given him his freedom. His approach was confident and welcoming, a far cry from the broken animal she'd first seen standing motionless in chains. "You know, Atlas," she said, offering him the apple that had become their ritual. "I thought I was saving you that night, but I think you might have saved me instead." Atlas's gentle rumble of contentment seemed to agree as the two unlikely partners, the elderly woman and the liberated bull, stood together in the fading Saskatchewan twilight, their bond a testament to the power of compassion to transform both the giver and receiver of mercy. The woman who decided to set a bull free had discovered that liberation was indeed a two-way process, proving that sometimes the most important chains we break are the ones that bind us to indifference in the face of suffering we have the power to end. In this story of courage, compassion, and the power of principled action, an elderly woman's refusal to ignore suffering transforms not just one animal's life, but an entire community's understanding of moral responsibility and the courage required to do what's right regardless of personal cost. For years, this bull lived in chains, until an elderly woman decided to set him free.